Life. Chapter 6. In late 1975, Ajahn Panya commenced work on a project that would consume much of his time over the following 2 years. The perimeter fence built around the monastery 10 years earlier no longer sufficed to protect the monastery from increasing outside encroachment. For years, the locals had cultivated rice fields right up to the monastery's border. At the end of each year's harvest, they lit fires to burn off the dry stubble from their fields to prepare for ploughing and planting the following season. Those unattended fires regularly swept through the boundary fence and burned large tracts of forest inside the monastery. Resident monks were obliged to hastily form water brigades, often in the dark, as they ferried carts of water from the well in an often futile attempt to douse the flames. Beyond that, some of the more recalcitrant villagers had started trespassing on monastery grounds to hunt animals that lived within that sacred sanctuary. To prevent further damage to the monastery's tranquil environment, ardent lay supporters approached Ajahn Mahabua with an offer to fund the construction of an 8-foot-high concrete wall around the entire circumference of the compound. Ajahn Mahabua agreed, on the condition that his engineer-in-chief, Ajahn Panya, be put in charge of the entire project. Ajahn Panya accepted the responsibility without complaint, but he sometimes wished that the lay supporters would see that there was more to the practice of Dhamma than just making merit by giving offerings to the monastery. People's desire to make merit in this way was no doubt praiseworthy, but he felt it unfortunate that many lay people understood making merit exclusively in terms of offering material support, which could at times be detrimental to the proper conditions for spiritual development. Although doing good deeds is a necessary first step on the path of Buddhist practice, success at that level alone does not lead directly to the ultimate happiness that transcends old age, sickness, and death. Leading a life solely based on acting in anticipation of future good results, a person fails to see the cause of suffering concealed in their good intentions. At the time of death, they are bound to face an unavoidable obstacle and be at a loss. Far better that people make a deep inquiry through practice into the Buddha's teaching, so that they can go beyond their dependence on an existence that is forever subject to karmic consequences. Taking up his new task, Ajahn Panya designed a wall that took into account the materials that were locally available and the capabilities of the local volunteer labor. He proposed using reusable metal panels to hold the concrete mixture in place for each casting, and had sheet metal fashioned to his specifications. Each section of the wall would be cast on site, so materials had to be portable enough to haul through the dense jungle. Casting concrete in place was relatively straightforward. First, reinforced concrete piers were constructed to add lateral strength and assure proper alignment of the two parallel metal forms that were anchored between the piers. Once both form faces were tied together and braced, fresh concrete was poured into the forms. That completed one section of the perimeter wall. The concrete batches were mixed by hand on site. Sand, gravel, and cement were combined with water in a shallow hand-dug trough and stirred together by villagers wielding long-handled hoes. Other villagers hoisted the fresh slurry to the top of the metal forms in buckets and filled them from a height of 8 feet. Since the circumference of the monastery reached nearly 1.5 miles, a total of more than 700 sections was required to enclose the property, a tedious and exhausting project which took the better part of 2 years to complete. By mid-1977, Ajahn Panya had secured the entire perimeter, with double front gates spanning the final section at the monastery's entrance. He soon turned his attention to remedying the monastery's shortage of drinking water. In consultation with Ajahn Mahabua, the decision was made to construct 6 large water storage tanks, 3 on each side of the sala. Ajahn Panya calculated that round tanks would provide greater strength and durability. His design was simple. 2 semicircular steel forms would be butted together to cast concrete rings 3 feet tall and 7 feet in diameter, with 5 rings stacked and cast one on top of the other to a height of 15 feet. 3 of those water storage tanks flanked the east side of the sala, and 3 more the west side. For many years, those tanks stored the monastery's only source of clean, potable water. The 6 new water tanks were fully finished and ready to receive the annual monsoon rainfall in May 1978. By that time, 5 other Western disciples of Ajahn Mahabua resided with him at Barntard Forest Monastery. The influx of new monks, plus a steady increase in English-speaking lay practitioners, meant an increase in Tarn Panya's teaching duties. He had resided continuously at the monastery for nearly 18 years, rarely leaving the compound except for an occasional trip to Bangkok for a health checkup. He was 52 years old and had long since given up the thought of returning to England. Instead, he adhered to a solemn vow, which he had made years before, to remain where he was until Ajahn Mahabua, who was nearing 64, passed away. Due to his age and the fact that his competence as a teacher was unquestioned, the junior monks began calling him Ajahn Panya, Ajahn being the Thai equivalent of teacher. During that period, his teaching responsibilities continued to expand. By then, most of the people attracted to Buddhism were people with an education, and he was seeing more and more monks who had been to college. Their minds had been trained to intellectualize and discriminate prolifically, and as Ajahn Panya well knew from his own experience, this excess of discursive clutter could be a hindrance for those new to the practice. Whether his students were beginners at meditation or monastics engaged in a lifetime of spiritual practice, Ajahn Panya stressed that the development of meditative concentration and wisdom requires adherence to certain universal principles. In essence, that process involved a progression from the external to the internal, from the coarse to the refined, from emphasis on the body to emphasis on the mind, and from a state of activity to a state of quiescence. To be successful, meditation needs to be a discipline that encompasses the whole person and all facets of one's daily life. It is a path of practice that encompasses both cause and effect, a proper foundation leading to proper results. Practitioners cannot simply choose to comply with some aspects of the path and neglect the others. Otherwise, all their efforts will ultimately prove disappointing. Even for those who follow a monastic lifestyle, it is never easy to relinquish the acquired habits that have burdened them since lay life, habits based on personal value judgments that close off avenues to Dhamma in the mind. New monks continue to discriminate on the basis of sights seen, sounds heard, odors inhaled, and tastes savored. They still form opinions about bodily contact and hold prejudiced notions in their minds. It is not easy for monks to let go of those habitual patterns of perception and simply experience things as they really are. To counter an ingrained tendency to rote learning and discursive thought among new monks, Ajahn Panya stressed that Buddhist training was not merely a matter of memorizing the words found in the suttas or in the teachings of the Ajahns. At the same time, he realized that words must be used to teach people about Buddhism. Although he knew that the true path transcended the distinctions on which language was based, he still tried to put his teachings in terms they would comprehend. His talks used language to make the Dhamma clear to his listeners, with the hope that those words would serve as motivation for them to put what they had learned into practice. The purpose of practice was not to increase knowledge, but rather to realize the true nature of Dhamma. However, before they could realize the Dhamma, they would need language as a tool to guide them to a true understanding of the meaning of the Buddha's teaching. Ajahn Panya reminded his listeners that although the Buddhist path did not exist in words, this did not mean that they should refrain from reading Dharma books or studying scriptures. Language's purpose was to point at the truth. Practitioners still had to discover the Dhamma for themselves if they wanted to realize the truth of the Buddha's teaching. Although a lot could be learned from books, they would discover that their actual experiences along the path differed from the descriptions found in books. From that standpoint, language is an obstacle to practice that is eventually overcome. In Buddhism, statements about truth are never presumed to be truth itself. When Ajahn Panya introduced Nibbana to his students, he presented it as an idea, a concept, but it was up to them to transform that concept into a transcendent realization. He conveyed to his students that they must look within themselves for the truth, not in texts or spoken words. The realization of a practitioner's higher aspirations is not so much dependent on accumulating knowledge, but on overcoming the mental hindrances and gaining insight into the truth at which the teaching points. Ajahn Panya reminded his students that the solitude offered by the forest environment in which they lived was essential for those who hoped to go beyond an intellectual understanding of the spiritual path and arrive at a true realization of what the Buddha taught. For that reason, the forest monastery was a natural environment for seekers like themselves who strived to transcend suffering. He emphasized that when they practiced Dharma, they had to be prepared for hardships. Even those born with very good karma were bound to find difficulties at every turn. In his experience, if results came easily, they usually faded easily as well. Understanding the true nature of Dhamma took a long time, and it required great determination to succeed. Those who cultivated Dhamma in the truest sense were few. Those who reached the highest realization were even fewer. Ajahn Panya impressed upon his students that the practice of wisdom covered a very broad range of mental phenomena. Because of that, they had to search for creative methods to deal with the countless possibilities that might arise in the course of their investigations. They could not expect the right methods to simply appear out of nowhere and present themselves. The right methods, the ones that were most suitable to their needs, could be quite elusive. It was not a matter of merely sitting back and observing awareness as it ebbed and flowed. They would have to search in earnest for the right method, or else they would never find it. They had to make a deliberate choice of what facets of the mind they were going to observe, selecting the most salient aspects based on their insights into the Dharma. For that to happen, they must really care about what they were doing. The investigation had to feel important to them. To be true cultivators of wisdom, they must take the time and the care to properly develop the practice of wisdom. If they did, the highest realization would not be beyond their reach. That was the gist of the general discourses Ajahn Panya gave to monks and lay practitioners alike. But he was keenly aware that people's temperaments and abilities differed widely. Just as all people are endowed with their own particular physical features, so is each person's character unique, making for a great variety of temperaments. Due to people's distinct backgrounds and the varying strength of their spiritual faculties, there can be no one-size-fits-all teaching which will suit everyone. In private interviews, Ajahn Panya intuitively tailored the depth and breadth of his teachings to fit the specific needs of each individual, knowing almost instinctively what each student needed to hear. Supervising building projects had always taken a physical toll in his younger days, leaving Ajahn Panya little time for deep and sustained periods of meditation. Now that he was older, and burdened with fewer strenuous activities, his daily routine became entirely his own, his heart unencumbered by meddlesome preoccupations. That left the Dharma as his preoccupation, and Dhamma promoted only contentment. Sitting peacefully in the solitude of his kuti, Ajahn Panya enjoyed doing small repair jobs and working alone. He had a knack for cleaning and repairing mechanical watches, a talent he had developed in his youth. Fellow monks fell into the habit of bringing him their ailing watches, and he quite selflessly worked on them without complaint. In the years since arriving at Ban Tad Forest Monastery, he had accepted hundreds of requests for cleaning and oiling and occasionally for repairs, until he became somewhat of a craftsman in the art of watch mechanics. He took special care with watches because he knew that a speck of dust or a tiny strand of hair or lint could easily interfere with the precision of a watch's movement. A slow, running watch indicated that the mechanical parts needed cleaning and oiling. It was a very common ailment in the northeastern region of Thailand, where fine, sandy dust permeated the air during the hot, dry months. Over the years, Ajahn Panya had collected a set of essential watchmaker's tools. If he was going to tune and adjust the mechanisms himself, It seemed natural to him to make use of the precision instruments needed for doing a proper and thorough job. The purpose of tools was a rational one, to do as meticulous a job as possible and achieve the best results each time. So he always made sure his screwdrivers were sharp and all his tools were clean and in good working condition. Ajahn Panya viewed proper cleaning and lubrication as one of the most important parts of watch repair and spent countless hours refining his techniques. When cleaning a watch, he worked not so much to discover something new, although he was always alert for new things, but mainly to reacquaint himself with familiar things. He found it instructive to revisit old terrain. He had cleaned and oiled mechanical watches so many times that he did not have to think much about how to do it anymore. However, even if he had been through something many times, his keen eyes remained constantly alert, looking for fresh angles or for anything unusual. He checked the watch mechanism the same way he examined his own meditation practice, never becoming complacent, looking for new and subtle things even though everything might seem the same as always. When digital watches replaced mechanical ones, Ajahn Panya received fewer and fewer requests for repairs. By that time, however, cassette tape players and recorders were being used by many monks to listen to Ajahn Mahabua's recorded talks. The dampness of the jungle environment had a corrosive effect on electronic circuits, and Ajahn Panya took it upon himself to revive those tape players that needed mending. He repaired tape recorders with the same attention to detail as he had with watches. He removed the circuit boards and checked for faulty connections. In some cases, he had to trace and diagram the recorder's circuit boards to work out the correct wire connections between the various components. Occasionally, he needed to rebuild the circuit board from scratch. Once he had made the schematic diagram, he converted it into a layout that could be fabricated onto a printed circuit board. He meticulously drafted by hand the complex arrangement of wires and circuit components on sheets of paper, using different color pens to represent capacitors, inductors, resistors, and the linkages between leads. His drawings were true works of art. The whole layout was transferred to the circuit board, which was then immersed in etching solution. After the etching was completed, electric components and leads were mechanically fixed to the board with a molten metal solder. The printed circuit board was then tested for correct voltages and resistances before replacing the defunct system. Treating every undertaking as a part of his practice, Ajahn Panya was continually careful to avoid making quick assumptions about the task before him, whether it involved mental activity, watch mechanics, or electrical circuits. He approached each task with an open and receptive mind. Ajahn Panya viewed each task in a way that allowed him to do it precisely and effortlessly, as though the thing he was working on became an extension of his own body and mind. No clear separation divided the external mechanism from the person doing the work. The passing years brought an ever-increasing stream of Western visitors to the monastery. Ajahn Panya's frequent talks to the monks and lay people usually took place in an informal setting and often inspired animated question and answer sessions. He excelled at the spontaneous back and forth of an open Dhamma discussion. He liked to play the devil's advocate in response to his students' queries, taking a commonly held conventional truth, turning it around and triumphantly declaring the opposite view as being equally valid. His style of teaching was characterized by taking his students' statements or questions and recasting them into Dharma terms that resonated with the heart rather than the intellect. Often he tried to surprise students out of their mechanical modes of thinking. Bringing them back into the present moment, he thus made them see the issue from a different, more comprehensive angle. Challenging his students' conventional wisdom, Ajahn Panya forced them to look back to their own resources to find the answers. Simply sitting in meditation did not mean a meditator was making progress. Ajahn Panya recognized that the only way for a teacher to determine how much a student understood was to test his wisdom in action. He often discovered this by assigning to a monk a task he had never done before. One with a strong wisdom practice was not easily upset when things went wrong. One whose practice lacked depth was consistently frustrated. He watched and listened to his students to determine how to best help them move forward. Some got the point right away, and they were rewarded with encouragement. Others seemed to take forever, and were advised to be patient. All were encouraged to carry mindfulness of the present moment into every event of daily life. Ajahn Panya rarely discussed the deeper levels of his own personal experiences in meditation. Although meditation was central to his life, he felt that he should not discuss the events of his own practice publicly with his students. He focused his teaching on helping them find the meditation method that best suited their temperament, and on inspiring them to train harder. Certain themes and methods which became more important to him over time received correspondingly more attention. He would, however, speak openly of his own search to find the truest version of the teaching. In this case, Ajahn Panya's principal motive for relating his own story was clearly instructional. He believed that this knowledge could help prevent his students from falling victim to certain contemporary teachings that he felt were misrepresenting the time-honored tradition of Theravada Buddhism. Ajahn Panya's teaching was liberating because it spoke about more than just everyday goodness. Addressing the inner workings of the mind and the transcendent paths and fruits with clarity and assurance, it featured some of the most thoughtful and illuminating expositions to be found in present-day Buddhist teachings. Always conscious of the spiritual maturity of his audience, he gave detailed advice on how to deal with mental obstacles such as anger, pain, and fear. In their totality, his teachings provided insight into the nature of the human condition, as much as they did into the virtues of the noble ones. Due to Ajahn Mahabua's overwhelming popularity in the circle of Dharma practice, Barntard Forest Monastery was soon transformed into a great centre of Buddhist meditation. Monks and laity alike gravitated to the monastery in hopes of receiving instruction from a genuine master. The many Western monks who came to learn from Ajahn Mahabua were able to share wholeheartedly in that unique religious experience. Highly revered at home and abroad, Ajahn Mahabua remained actively engaged in teaching both monastics and lay practitioners, elucidating for them the fundamental principles of Buddhism and encouraging them to practice the same bold and incisive techniques that his teacher, Ajahn Monde, had so effectively used. Throughout that period of expansion, Ajahn Panya's expertise in the practical application of engineering know-how had allowed the monastic community to keep up with the changing times. From the outset, he was involved in almost every building project carried out at Barntard Forest Monastery, often designing the projects and overseeing their implementation himself. Ajahn Mahabua had so much faith in his wisdom and his engineering skills that he rarely questioned Ajahn Panya's judgment in those matters. Whether the engineering was electrical or mechanical, structural or electronic, he had mastered them all on his own initiative and could apply them with a skill and grace that consistently amazed his fellow monks. The ease with which Barntard Forest Monastery developed from a simple forest monastery into a thriving monastic centre is a testament to Ajahn Panya's ability to manage the monastery's resources, while protecting its traditions and keeping its peaceful, meditative environment intact. Aside from his chronically swollen foot and a host of lingering aches and ailments, Ajahn Panya's health remained predictably stable over the years. The hot and humid seasons took their toll on his physical vitality, but minor operations, on his foot, appendix and prostate, did little to slow him down in old age. He appeared to be aging gracefully with unflagging vigour. Then, at the age of 77 in the monsoon days of September 2003, a routine blood test uncovered telltale traces of internal bleeding. A slow and almost imperceptible loss of blood was occurring somewhere within his body. By analysing the blood count, the doctors measured the loss, but they could not pinpoint its location. Follow-up tests pointed to the colon as the most likely culprit. When a colonoscopy exam discovered a malignant growth at the upper end of Ajahn Panya's large intestine, The doctors insisted on operating immediately to remove the tumor. Ajahn Panya was not noticeably sick. In fact, he felt and appeared quite buoyant. If the doctors had not detected it through a blood test, he would not have suspected a problem. After a period of calm reflection, Ajahn Panya gratefully dismissed their offer of surgery, saying he preferred instead to treat the malignancy with traditional herbal medicines. A disciple of his at the monastery quickly arranged for the delivery of a potent Thai herbal remedy, which Ajahn Panya began ingesting immediately. Appearing unfazed by the urgency surrounding his condition, he carried on with his daily routine as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Convinced that the medicine was working, he travelled to Bangkok several months later to get a full checkup. An MRI scan found that the tumour had shrunk from its original length of 5 centimetres down to only 1 centimetre. The news was welcome and most encouraging. Ajahn Panya took the herbal concoction scrupulously for an additional 5 months. In early May 2004, he was admitted to the hospital for another colonoscopy. The results confirmed what he suspected, that the tumour had disappeared. No graphic evidence of it could be found. The upper colon appeared blessedly free of cancer. He seemed to be out of the woods. The question then arose, should he continue with the herbal medication now that the treatment had proved successful? A specialist in traditional Thai medicine advised him against halting the therapy abruptly. Instead, he was advised to carry on with it, but at half the dosage. His attendant monks pleaded with him to play it safe and heed the doctor's advice. Ajahn Panya concluded otherwise. Contrary to the broad consensus of his supporters, he decided to discontinue the herbal remedy, reasoning that it had done its job and was no longer needed. It turned out to be a fateful decision. Within 6 weeks, Ajahn Panya's health seriously degenerated. His students could see that his former vitality and alertness were waning. As time passed, the decline became more pronounced. By mid-July, he experienced an ongoing and severe intestinal disorder. It became clear that he was having a relapse, and that this time he would not survive. The prospect of death hung like a cloud over the hearts of his disciples and permeated the monastic community with an intense awareness of its imminence. In Ajahn Panya's presence, death assumed a special significance, not as an impetus for melancholy thoughts, but as an urgent reminder that one's time on earth is fleeting. This was the final lesson that he bestowed on all of his students. Ajahn Panya's death was not an easy one. His room, filled with the odour of incipient decay, was overwhelmingly silent but for the sound of his laboured breathing. Yet despite the uncertainty surrounding his potentially prolonged infirmity, he exuded a peaceful inner confidence, a spirited manifestation of his faith in the training and his fearlessness of death. That inner refuge enabled him to face death in a way that was at once thoughtful and serene. During the final week of his life, Ajahn Panya's overriding challenge was the constant fatigue of a body that had spent its karmic energy. He succumbed to utter exhaustion. His attendants were advised that unless he was induced to eat something, his digestive system would shut down, leaving him quickly at death's doorstep. Hospital doctors suggested placing a feeding tube through the nose and into his stomach. He flatly refused. Lay supporters hastily arranged the preparation of flasks of soup and nutritious broths, which they offered in abundance each morning. But Ajahn Panya found it burdensome to force down even a few spoonfuls. Unable to eat, he gradually grew so weak that he could hardly manage even the simplest movements on his own. He continued to talk and laugh with those around him, but in a voice so faint they strained to make out what he said. Trying to force down a brew of his favourite tea, he joked with his attendants that nothing spoiled a good cup of tea like colonic cancer. When asked how he felt, he murmured softly that he felt no pain, only debilitating weakness. Several times the doctors offered to administer morphine, but his calm and quiet response was gently dismissive. Ajahn Panya remained alert and responsive to his environment until the night of August 16th, when he seemed to let go of the external world completely. His breathing the following morning was deep and measured, but he evinced no knowledge of the world around him. Throughout that day and the final night, his breath became progressively shorter and shallower. By the early morning of August 18th, his breathing was soft and smooth but very frail. Soon it was barely discernible. Eventually it became so faint that no one knew precisely when it stopped completely. The monks attending to Ajahn Panya in his final hour estimated the time to be 8:30 a.m. Ajahn Panya's passing was more than simply the death of a good monk. His death was a display of the depth of his realization and the power of the teaching that he had come to embody. In death, Ajahn Panya made his disciples aware that teachers of his caliber often concealed many exceptional qualities during their lifetime. Sometimes they showed them fully, only at the moment of their death. Ajahn Panya's earnest conviction in the simplicity of a bhikkhu's life was evident from the mere handful of belongings that he left behind. Although born at a gold mine, gold was no different to him than dust. He never fell victim to fortune, fame, or worldly ambition. He did not have the reputation of a world-renowned teacher, a famous author, or an erudite scholar. Nor did he exhibit mystical powers, claim psychic encounters with devas, or remain in seclusion for lengthy solitary periods. He simply demonstrated that the truth of the Lord Buddha's teaching was to be found at the very heart of one's being. With grace and humility, he shared his wisdom and his confidence in the power of Dhamma to help liberate the minds of his fellow human beings. On August 28th, 10 days after his death, Ajahn Panya's bodily remains were cremated at Ban Tad Forest Monastery. A special funeral pyre, covered by an ornate Thai-style canopy, was constructed on a broad stretch of ground at the front of the monastery, near a spacious pavilion that was built for use on large and important occasions. However, the pavilion was not nearly spacious enough to contain the thousands of monks and the tens of thousands of Buddhist faithful who gathered from all over the country, as well as from abroad, to offer their last respects to the monk whose impeccable goodness had warmed the hearts of so many people. The ceremony took place on a bright, cloudless afternoon, a blessed and welcome change from the stifling heat of the ongoing monsoons. For a moment, as Ajahn Panya's casket was placed atop the funeral pyre, the whole crowd was still. Then, an extraordinary occurrence attracted everyone's attention skyward. Against the clear blue sky shone a fiery white light from a blinding, seemingly boundless source. A diamond-bright heart radiating outwards and fading to a softly diffused, circular glow. Around this white diamond was a second circle, a ring of rainbow light with an outer border of luminous white down. It was the sun, resplendent in breathtaking purity, encircled by a magnificent rainbow which suffused the translucent, wispy clouds with a prismatic glow. This sudden apparition drew the gaze of the whole congregation and transfixed it on the heavens. A soft, amazed murmur passed through the crowd as the circular rainbow slowly dissipated and faded from view. Twice more during the course of the funeral ceremony, the natural elements conspired to conjure the same amazing phenomenon. It was as though the power of Ajahn Panya's spiritual attainment had induced this image to reflect the depth and subtlety of his virtue for all to witness. That vivid testimony to Ajahn Panya's profound spiritual awakening marked a supremely graceful conclusion to the life and practice of a monk whose kindness and humility radiated softly from his being to encompass the whole sentient universe. Eulogy. The venerable monk who passed away on August 18, 2004, was beloved both in spirit and in person, an amazing teacher with an incisive, inquiring mind, wise and kind beyond measure. Such was the view of all who were fortunate enough to make Ajahn Panya's acquaintance. Those individuals met a man who moved with a focused and deliberate gait, limping slightly from an ailing right foot with steps that never faltered. His neck and broad shoulders stooped slightly, his face sloped forward, and was highlighted by a long, fleshy nose and slim, benevolent lips. His powerful hands were those of a craftsman. Shorn, silver hair flanked his large, flaring ears, while his kind brown eyes glowed with good humor. But what people noticed most about Ajahn Panya was his presence. His gaze and his bearing were those of a venerable sage. At the monastery, many people approached Ajahn Panya to make or perhaps renew his acquaintance, addressing him with warm-hearted devotion and respect. He was not one to seek out such encounters, but he would accept the deference paid him in a calm and detached manner with a mildly quizzical look of surprise, as if he was not quite sure who deserved the approbation. Ajahn Panya had a soft, deep voice, as soothing as a cool forest stream. He would speak quietly to those who sought his presence, his head leaning affably to one side, inspiring respect and careful attention. Otherwise, content to remain aloof, Ajahn Panya seldom spoke except when spoken to, and never appeared to speak too much. He was unobtrusive and exuded a soothing gentleness that naturally made him the center of every situation. Being near him, one sensed his palpable inner peace and serenity. His gaze was open, calm and benevolent, free of conflict, bias, or judgment. With his warmth, his wisdom, and his compassion, Ajahn Panya personified the nobility of the teachings. By his personal example, the Dharma was rendered practical and vibrant with life. His teachings inspired in others an unshakable confidence in the Dhamma and a conviction in the central importance of a trusted teacher. Those who encountered his virtuous qualities tended to become acutely aware of the greed, the aversion, and the selfish instincts clouding their own hearts. Earnest practitioners saw in his exemplary manner and freedom from attachments the special teacher whom they longed to encounter. Ajahn Panya's sacred duty to his students was to clearly describe the coarse and grasping conditions constricting the human heart, while at the same time making them aware of the pure nature of mind lying dormant and stifled within. With his words, he transported his listeners into a state of concentrated attention, fully engrossed in and open to the Dhamma and its boundless potential for liberation. The people who travelled from far and wide to meet him were often beginners on the path, still flush with worldly attitudes, concerns, and passions. When Ajahn Panya treated them kindly, they were likely to respond with emotion. But he was immune to the pull of worldly relationships. In his monk's life of discipline and renunciation, he had left behind the emotions associated with family, friends, and romance. He responded to all people with perfect equanimity, having long since abandoned the entangling relationships that inevitably lead to loss and suffering. The fires of passion and emotion had been quieted in his heart. However, many lay supporters had yet to disengage their minds from attachment to worldly ambitions of gain and fame. They admired Ajahn Panya's humility, but they also wanted him to receive the prestige and recognition that his exalted character deserved. While he himself had no use for such attentions, it frustrated them that he refused to tout his own merits and take personal credit for his achievements. In the monastic community, however, Ajahn Panya's combination of humbleness and integrity was highly valued. His fellow monks felt he was someone to whom they could entrust their lives. Ajahn Panya learned to accept the circumstances at hand without resistance. He simply allowed the present moment to be, accepting the changing nature of all things and conditions. His fluid understanding of the nature of change came from deep penetration into the truth of the Dhamma. As a teacher, this understanding allowed him to address different circumstances and situations in creative ways. He cautioned against imposing one's own prescriptive views on the world, particularly regarding those social and environmental issues that often became celebrated causes among his students. He was well aware that cycles come and cycles go, that all things pass away, but with attachment severed, he felt no fear of loss. When teaching the public, Ajahn Panya sympathized with their commitment to social goals. But he also knew that serving the social community at large did not take precedence over serving the cause of Dhamma. He fervently believed that self-realization was the greatest contribution he could make to his fellow men and women. Ajahn Panya never permitted himself to indulge in feelings of satisfaction or disappointment. When things went smoothly, he did not feel especially elated. When encountering obstacles or failure, he was not dejected. He did not struggle against the inevitable. He simply found the means to persevere. The determination to proceed resolutely, regardless of obstacles or difficulties, was a guiding principle in his life. As he approached death, he still kept his feet planted firmly on the Buddha's noble path, never taking for granted that his work was completed. What was Ajahn Panya's contribution to the world of contemporary Buddhism? His compassion led him to share the fruits of his uncommon wisdom, enabling those near him to resonate in harmony with the Lord Buddha's teaching. He tailored his teaching methods to his students' social and cultural backgrounds, as well as to their unique characters. He made Buddhism relevant to his students by breathing life into the Buddha's teaching, inspiring them to take spirited strides on the noble path to freedom. Like the Buddha's eminent disciples, Ajahn Panya taught the Dharma that was good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the right meaning and expression. With his spare, clear and simple teaching style, he laid out a roadmap for travelers along the path. For those who earnestly seek the way, his teachings reveal the path to a perfectly contented and purified heart. Studied carefully and with an open heart, Ajahn Panya's teachings can help reignite a practice that has stalled after an initial burst of heartfelt progress. For those who have grown complacent in their knowledge of the Buddhist path, the fruits of his wisdom may open the mind to new horizons of the Dhamma and new avenues of introspection. At the very least, he offers a view from the mountaintop to practitioners who otherwise might have only a vague notion of the heights attainable on the Buddha's noble path.